Explosions ripped through the walls of Brest Fortress as German artillery rained down relentlessly. By dawn, the barracks lay in ruins, communication lines were silenced, and smoke filled the air. Red Army soldiers clawed their way from the rubble, diving into shattered bunkers and defensive positions. Encircled, outnumbered, and cut off from orders, they continued to resist. Despite facing air raids, relentless shelling, and flamethrowers, civilians rushed supplies and ammunition to the front lines, while medics dragged the wounded to safety. Scrawled on the fortress walls, the defenders' defiance was clear: "I may die, but I will not yield." In the months before June 1941, the Soviet Union appeared to coexist peacefully with Nazi Germany. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939, formalized this uneasy relationship. Its secret clauses divided Eastern Europe between the two powers, while the public non-aggression agreement allowed Germany to concentrate on the Western Front. For Stalin, it was a calculated move. The pact sowed discord among Western powers and gave the USSR time to strengthen its influence, annexing Poland, the Baltic states, Bessarabia, and parts of northern Bukovina. The Red Army expanded its territory, yet it did so under a false sense of security. Intelligence reports from Soviet agents, border officials, and foreign diplomats repeatedly warned of German troop buildup along the western frontier. Stalin, however, was skeptical. He believed British reports were designed to provoke the USSR into war and trusted Hitler's assurances that German troop movements were defensive measures against the British. Even when the GRU and NKVD presented concrete evidence, he often dismissed it. Hitler himself corresponded with Stalin, insisting that any German provocations were the fault of disloyal generals, and that the Soviet response should be diplomatic rather than military. This mistrust of intelligence stemmed partly from Stalin's purge of the late 1930s, which decimated the Red Army's leadership. Thousands of experienced officers were removed through imprisonment, dismissal, or execution. By 1941, three-quarters of Red Army officers had been in their positions for less than a year. Experience had been replaced by fear and blind obedience. Officers hesitated to report bad news that might displease Stalin. Soviet strategic positioning further amplified vulnerabilities. Expanding into Poland and the Baltics pushed the frontier hundreds of kilometers west, leaving old defensive lines obsolete and newly stationed divisions exposed. Key installations, airfields, barracks, command centers, remained exposed to immediate German strikes, as planned defenses were delayed or abandoned. The Red Army lacked depth in its defenses. Forward deployed units near the border meant that any breakthrough by German forces would encounter minimal resistance behind the first line. This forward deployment reflected Soviet doctrine at the time, which emphasized offensive capability over defense. Massive armored formations, including the advanced T-34 and KV tanks, symbolized confidence. However, these modern tanks represented only a fraction of the army. Most units relied on outdated and unreliable models like the T-26 and BT series. Mechanical failures, shortages of spare parts, radios, recovery vehicles, and trained mechanics rendered many units ineffective. Similarly, the Soviet Air Force, although numerically vast, depended largely on outdated aircraft such as the Polikarpov I-15 and I-16, outmatched by the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Newer planes like the MiG-3 and Yak-1 were entering service slowly, and pilots were often undertrained and unfamiliar with these machines. Thousands of aircraft were concentrated at exposed airfields near the border, creating easy targets for the Luftwaffe. Despite their vast numbers and apparent strength, the Red Army faced severe logistical and strategic weaknesses. When the German attack finally came, the combination of unprepared defenses, inexperienced leadership, and overconfidence would prove disastrous. Opus Clip isn't merely a tool for cutting videos. It's a full-featured AI-driven editing platform designed to save creators valuable time. Whether you're producing content for a personal channel or expanding your reach professionally, it helps you focus on storytelling rather than tedious edits. Affordable and user-friendly, it's ideal for creators of all levels. Transform your raw footage into compelling moments with Opus Clip. Just click the link in the description and use the code HISTORY to enjoy a week free plus 50% off your subscription for 3 months. On the morning of June 22, 1941, the fragile calm of peace vanished without warning. Across a vast 2,900 kilometers, 1,820 miles, stretch, German forces unleashed a relentless barrage. Artillery rained down on Soviet fortifications, while waves of Luftwaffe bombers tore through the skies, striking airfields, depots, and barracks simultaneously. A Soviet pilot later recalled tossing aside a tent flap only to see enemy planes strafing nearby tents, leaving the wounded and dead around him. Throwing on his overalls, he ran toward the hangars, where aircraft lined up for inspection were already engulfed in flames. Within the first day, the Soviet Air Force lost roughly 1,800 to 2,000 planes, many destroyed on the ground. The Red Army was exposed. Units stationed near the border lacked fortifications or contingency plans, communication lines were severed almost immediately, and headquarters struggled to interpret the chaos. Entire divisions found themselves isolated, leaderless, or encircled before they could properly respond. At the highest levels, silence reigned. Stalin delayed formal orders for nearly half a day. Despite repeated intelligence warnings, Hitler's manipulation of Stalin's paranoia about capitalist conspiracies led him to dismiss early alerts as potential provocations meant to destabilize the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. At the front, officers had little room for independent decision-making. The purges of the 1930s had left the command structure fractured, leaving cautious leaders hesitant to act without instructions. As German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory, uncertainty dominated the ranks. Major General Radon Malinovsky later recounted asking whether they could open fire on invading forces, only to be told, "Do not fall for provocation, do not fire." Yet pockets of resistance did emerge. One of the first obstacles to the German advance appeared at Brest Fortress in Belarus. The 45th Infantry Division had expected a swift victory, only to face a brutal, close-quarters fight. Soviet soldiers, joined by nurses and civilians, transformed the ruined fortress into a maze of defensive positions. Surrounded and cut off, they held out against artillery, flamethrowers and air attacks for 8 days. Further north, the Soviet 2nd Tank Division moved to confront the German 6th Panzer Division near Rzyniai in Lithuania. While most Soviet tanks were quickly destroyed, the heavier KV-2 tanks inflicted serious damage on the smaller German panzers. In one notable incident, a single KV-2 blocked a key supply route for nearly 2 days, withstanding anti-tank weapons, artillery, and even satchel charges before being finally neutralized. Though isolated, this episode demonstrated that Soviet armor could dominate when deployed effectively. Meanwhile in Moscow the atmosphere was tense and uncertain. 4 hours after the invasion, Stalin issued no directives. Years of relying on Hitler's assurances and ignoring mounting intelligence left him blindsided. He continued to forbid border crossing or offensive measures, insisting that the massive German invasion was simply a provocation by rogue commanders. Even as German divisions poured in, he attempted to reach Berlin by telephone, convinced Hitler would restrain his forces. Eventually, reality began to sink in, but Stalin remained largely hidden from the Soviet populace. He delegated Vyacheslav Molotov to announce the state of war over the radio later that afternoon. The following day, Stalin quietly convened the General Staff Bureau to issue the first formal orders, establishing the Stavka under Marshal Semyon Timoshenko. Defensive positions were set, marking the Soviet Union's full commitment to war. Over the next weeks, the Western Front struggled to slow the German blitzkrieg, but chaotic deployments nearly resulted in total collapse. Massive encirclements at Białystok and Minsk trapped 4 Soviet armies. By July 9, over 341,000 troops had been killed, captured, or went missing. Material losses included thousands of tanks, guns, and aircraft. In the south, German and Romanian forces advanced deep into Ukraine, surrounding additional Soviet units by early August. Behind the front lines, Luftwaffe air raids devastated infrastructure. Factories, depots, and transport hubs were hit relentlessly. Rail lines that remained functional were clogged with retreating units, refugees, and wrecked equipment. Ammunition storage sites and airfields were abandoned in haste. The scale of destruction forced the Soviet state into an emergency response, dismantling factories and transporting equipment eastward, beyond the reach of advancing Germans. Despite the Luftwaffe's attacks, production of essential supplies, vehicles, and aircraft continued in the east. Meanwhile, Soviet leadership gradually regained control. The initial paralysis gave way to cautious coordination, as the USSR reorganized defenses and prepared for the long, brutal war ahead. After 10 days of silence, Stalin finally appeared on the airwaves on July 3 to speak directly to the nation. Diplomacy was no longer mentioned. Stripping away the formalities of his office, he urged citizens to defend their homeland, to organize partisan units behind enemy lines, and to prepare for a grueling, protracted conflict. Within a month, Stalin quietly took on the role of Supreme Commander-in-Chief. As the Red Army began to achieve victories on the front lines, Stalin's leadership became increasingly visible. By assuming supreme command, he placed the burden of defending the entire Soviet Union squarely upon his shoulders. By mid-July, though battered and bloodied, the Red Army had not been broken. German forces pushed relentlessly toward Moscow, but Soviet troops managed to stabilize the front enough at Smolensk to delay the enemy's advance. Since early July, Marshal Timoshenko had thrown every available resource into slowing the German advance. Army Group Center eventually surrounded Smolensk and several Soviet field armies, but not without cost. A significant number of soldiers from the 19th and 20th Armies escaped back to Soviet lines. Meanwhile, the German timetable for Operation Barbarossa was disrupted, straining their already fragile logistics. By late August, the Red Army launched a counteroffensive west of Smolensk under General Georgy Zhukov near Yelnya. The operation was costly in lives and its territorial gains were limited, but it marked a psychological victory. Soviet forces had, for the first time, forced the Germans to retreat. While fighting raged on the main fronts, resistance movements were forming across occupied territories. In the forests and villages of Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia, isolated soldiers, political officers, and civilians began to organize. Armed with few weapons and minimal support, these early partisan groups sabotaged railways, ambushed convoys, and carried out assassinations before melting back into the forest. Over the summer, coordination with the NKVD improved, allowing partisan detachments behind enemy lines to operate more efficiently and align with broader intelligence efforts. Although these actions did not stop the German advance, they forced the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS to divert critical resources to combat partisans, worsening their logistical situation. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence quietly achieved significant victories. NKVD cryptanalysts under Sergei Tolstoy successfully decoded Japanese diplomatic communications, confirming Japan would not attack the USSR. Red Army codebreakers intercepted Romanian military messages, providing a clearer picture of enemy strategy in Ukraine. By late summer 1941, Soviet commanders noticed an unexpected shift in German movements. Armored divisions that were supposed to advance directly toward Moscow began diverting north and south. The High Command realized the Germans were no longer focused solely on the Central Front. In the south, Red Army officers warned of a major buildup aimed at Kiev, but Stalin refused to authorize a withdrawal. The southwestern front mounted a heroic but doomed defense of Ukraine, leaving them encircled and annihilated. Nearly 760,000 soldiers were lost, with over 486,000 killed or missing, including the front commander, General Mikhail Karponos. Despite these catastrophic losses, the delay came at a strategic cost to the Germans. While Ukraine fell, the Central Front remained relatively quiet, giving the Soviets time to rebuild armies, reposition defenses, and continue the industrial evacuation. In the north, defenders of Leningrad held firm against Army Group North and Finnish forces, who reached the city's outskirts by September. Germany's 4th Panzer Group spearheaded the attack but failed to penetrate further. Instead, the city was surrounded, entering a siege that would last 872 days. Inside Leningrad, Red Army units established defensive perimeters, reinforced by Baltic naval forces and over 135,000 militia volunteers. Civilians, armed with rifles, joined the defense, but starvation, bombardment, and disease claimed countless lives. A tenuous supply route across Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life, allowed limited provisions to enter the city during winter months, preventing total collapse. Meanwhile, the renewed German offensive toward Moscow sent waves of panic through the defenders, a reaction Stalin sought to manage before it could undermine morale. Since the beginning of the invasion, leadership within the Red Army had been highly unstable. Commanders who failed to execute Stalin's orders faced severe consequences: demotion, dismissal, or even execution. This harsh reality was underscored in July with the execution of West Front Commander General Dmitry Pavlov and his staff. By late October, the cost of failure became even more evident when 25 previously arrested officers were executed near Kuybyshev and Saratov. Stalin's approach was merciless, but he tolerated no weakness in leadership at one of the war's most critical moments. The Soviet High Command could not afford inefficiency or incompetence. German delays on the Central Front provided a vital breathing space for the defense of Moscow. The city's fortifications were strengthened, logistics were reorganized, and new armies were formed. Stalin appointed General Zhukov to oversee Moscow's defense, while hundreds of thousands of reservists and new recruits were mobilized from across the Soviet Union. Some divisions were redeployed from the east, but most forces defending the capital were newly raised, reconstructed, or drawn from existing reserves. By early autumn, the Red Army around Moscow had shifted from a scattered and reactive force to a well-positioned, reinforced defensive line, ready to confront the enemy. Seasonal challenges added further strain. The infamous Rasputitsa, Russia's muddy autumn, slowed movement, immobilized vehicles and clogged supply routes. Though grueling, these conditions proved more manageable for the Soviets than for the German invaders. Construction of defensive positions continued despite the mud, while reinforcements and supplies gradually reached the front. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union secured crucial assistance from the Western Allies, facilitated by Ambassador Maxim Litvinov. In October 1941, the initial protocol of the Lend-Lease Agreement came into effect. Although modest at first, shipments of raw materials, boots, trucks, and food arrived through the Arctic ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The Soviet Navy played a key role in escorting, offloading, and safeguarding these shipments under constant threat from German air and naval attacks. Despite the growing ice and the Luftwaffe overhead, naval crews and dock workers ensured supplies reached the front, bolstering both the Army's capabilities and morale. By late November, Rasputitsa gave way to freezing temperatures. The front lines were locked in place, and Soviet forces still faced shortages of food, ammunition, and winter clothing as well as cases of frostbite. However, prior experience in the Winter War allowed commanders to respond quickly. Transport battalions employed every available means, trains, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, sleds pulled by reindeer and pack mules, to bring supplies from rear depots. While the cold offered no outright advantage, shorter Soviet supply lines enabled faster responses to logistical challenges. Reconnaissance by early December revealed a critical weakness. German forces were overextended, understrength, and incapable of advancing further. Exhausted from months of combat and hampered by strained supply lines, the Wehrmacht stalled just kilometers from Moscow. The Soviet High Command recognized an opportunity and quietly finalized preparations for a counteroffensive. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers assembled on the western Kalinin and Bryansk fronts. Fresh rifle divisions, artillery brigades, and tank units were deployed strategically. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched its counterattack. The initial assault caught German forces by surprise. Coordinated strikes along a wide front targeted vulnerable flanks, forcing the enemy into retreat. In the following weeks, Soviet forces pushed the Germans back between 100 and 250 kilometers, 62 to 155 miles, from the capital. Towns such as Beluga, Klint, and Kalinin were liberated rapidly. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time since June, the Red Army dictated the pace of the conflict. While German units soon entrenched and the front stabilized, the myth of their invincibility had been shattered. Inside the Soviet Union, this victory became a potent symbol of resilience and strategic foresight, amplified through propaganda. Yet the success came at a staggering human cost. Since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army had suffered more than 4.5 million casualties, including 2.3 million captured and subjected to brutal treatment in German captivity. Despite these sacrifices, Moscow remained standing and the Red Army had endured. Operation Barbarossa had failed, marking the beginning of a turning point in the war. The survival of the capital and the resilience of Soviet forces demonstrated that even under extreme adversity, the Red Army could resist, regroup, and strike back.